We're now into our penultimate session, and we're going to be looking at the challenge as the creative opportunity with a fantastic panel of speakers. And just before I introduce them, we have a couple of films to show you.
Sorry. Come on.
A toy bar of chocolate, please. It's for my mum.
Your change.
Happy birthday, Mum.
There's always been a glass and a half in everyone.
Fantastic. Please welcome to the stage David Clements, UK Marketing Lead at Mondelez International, Clare Hutchinson, Chief Strategy Officer at VCCP, Emily Laws, Head of Brand at Lucky Saint, and Harjot Singh, who's Global Chief Strategy Officer at McCann and McCann Worldgroup.
Oh, these are comfortable. They are. So, it's the last session of the day, and we're all really happy to be here, and thank you for joining us. I mean, if there's one thing we were all just, reflecting in the green room, if there's one thing we've seen today, there's so much in common between politics and advertising. We wouldn't really say that ever before, but the truth is, let's just face it, we've learned today they both rely on creativity to be successful. I mean, to be successful in helping ideas and ideologies prevail, persuading people, and helping ideas perform with certainty. And then we also know that they're both capable, very capable, of injecting growth and vitality in an economy. And advertising does that by creating new demand, maybe even conjuring up new audiences and categories. But then the question and the theme of this conference, which is about responsible growth, I love this. It all works if it all works. And that brings up these questions that, well, the kind of growth that advertising can, revitalize an economy with, are there any trade-offs over there? I mean, it helps us make significant progress against commercial goals, but can it help us do that against social goals as well? Can we create advertising that helps us build trust, grow markets, but also do that in a way that also helps us advance on things like social inclusivity that are so important for us and for the world at large? And if that is possible, who's better positioned to do that? Do big brands have a better opportunity because they've got legacy, because they've got history, Or do small brands or new brands who don't have that much to lose, arguably, do they have a better shot at it? I mean, these are some of the questions. Are these trade-offs inevitable or not? And if not, does everyone have an equally good shot at getting that right? These are just some of the questions we're going to talk about today. We have a lot more, but then we've only got 27 minutes and 56 seconds. We're going to make the best use of that time. So welcome this amazing group of panelists. You all know who they are. But I'm going to not waste time introducing them. What we're going to do is really start talking about growth, because that's the whole point of this conference. And when we talk about growth, I think it's front and center for the economy, for companies and brands. And I'm going to start with everyone over here and just throw it out there. But before we do that, before we talk about growth, any immediate impressions, thoughts, ideas about what we've seen so far about this conference, the session prior? Any thoughts?
I think for me, one of the things I know that was talked about earlier was longevity. And I think for us as a challenger brand, sometimes people assume that you're young and nimble and you're a challenger brand and you want to be disruptive, so you want to jump on every new trend or new calendar hook that's happening. But actually, for us, we want to create that longevity and we want to create legacy. So it's amazing seeing what Cadbury have done, because that is the end goal for us. We want to have a 200-year campaign one day. And I know that that was talked about in terms of growth and thinking about the long term rather than the short term. And definitely in our business, we're now 5 years old. We're kind of a scale up instead of a startup, and being efficient and growing responsibly and efficiently from a budget perspective, but also being really conscious of sustainability is super important to us. So I thought that was really interesting that earlier they were talking about longevity, because I think that is something that we talk a lot about, even though we're a really young brand.
And I think, I totally agree. I think one of the challenges is, it's very easy, particularly when times are hard, to look for a quick fix, to look for something that's going to suddenly kind of make a big difference, whether that be votes, instant quick votes, or whether that be, helping the bottom line from a business perspective. But, from our perspective, there is something very much that, both politics and brands have in common, which is the importance and need to build trust. And those things are only built if you build them on a strong foundation of being meaningful, being relevant, and doing it consistently. And I think to the 200 years point for us, that has been about, for Cadbury, focusing around one very simple word, generosity, which goes through everything that we do, and that consistency and having that sort of ability to be very, very focused and very strict around what you do and what you say. And that isn't at odds with creativity. And I think it's very easy to think that doing the same thing time and time again, how creative can that be? But for us, it's about being always the same and always different. I think with creativity, if you have something simple, the constraint of that actually gives you huge freedom to create that compound creativity, to build meaning, to build equity, whether you're a political party or whether you are a brand like Cadbury or like Lucky Saint, that kind of ability to build that meaning in people's lives and to be relevant to people's lives and to make a difference for the long term, not the short term, is what growth is really about.
Mm-hmm. I think just listening to the previous session from the Reckitt's team, you can see a lot of similarities and parallels with where we're trying to go as a brand. I think what was, and you see it, and we were just talking about it a little bit off stage in terms of some brands are there for a moment in time and it's a quick fix and it's something that is used to drive attention, but actually is that ingrained through an organization? Is that something that's consistently trying to build and really drive social change, not just a quick fix to drive a brand uplift or something like that? And that was the bit, just as the story unpacked there on stage, just seeing just how ingrained it is through the organization, just talking about the D&I policies, just talking about the next steps that trying to evolve that social cause. That's exactly, I think, the angle that we take from a Cadbury perspective. And generosity is at our heart. There's something that comes from 200 years ago with George Cadbury that very much starts in creating this amazing environment around Bourneville, around looking after workers, investing into facilities and the environment that people are operating within. And that's something that stays true all the way through to today for the organisation, the brand that we're working on today. So I love seeing that. I love hearing that strategy is at the heart of everything first and foremost as well, because if you have that right, then I think the outcomes that you can drive are pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I pick up, sorry, you were going to say?
I was going to say, to add to that idea of like doing something again and again and being consistent, I think it's so important to not think of that as uncreative.
Yeah.
For us at Lucky Saint, I remember presenting to our internal team our Dry January campaign this year, and we used the same creative that we did last year, but we had this like internal theme of fresh consistency. So we used the same imagery. It looks very similar. We used some new copy lines, and I was really nervous to present that to the team, thinking that everyone would be like, what, we're doing that again? That's really boring. But actually everyone was super excited because they really believe in our brand assets, and that was really important to us. And I've seen other small brands kind of want to do something different all the time, and I think sometimes love LinkedIn, it's great, but the idea of like posting something and getting lots of likes can overtake the idea of like slowly building a brand. And for us, like the purple colour of Cadbury and the gold writing, like we want people to feel that about the Lucky Saint Nun and the bold blue font. Like we want that consistency, and I think if you don't do that, you don't really have a brand. So hearing you say that, I'm going to take that back to the office.
No, it's really...
like ultimately, you know, humans love familiarity. It makes us comfortable. Familiarity breeds content rather than contempt.
If it's done right.
In our world. And I think, you know, we ran the same Christmas ad for 2 years in a row, which, you know, if you look at the rest of the industry, that seems like a kind of a crime to run. You know, Christmas is the time we should be doing the big fancy ad. But for us, actually doing the same thing because it was loved the year before. It was also incredibly effective as well as being efficient, and it was generous at Christmas to the nation to give people the ability to give chocolate secretly to someone that they love with Secret Santa. So I think familiarity is our friend in terms of connecting with people.
I'd say it's hard though as well. You talk about responsible growth. I think the short-term challenges are always there in any organisation. I think everyone in this audience here and on stage here, growth is our obsession. Like if I look at the organisation I work for, like if we don't have growth in the short term and the longer term, then it's a really challenging position. And how you navigate that, both the short and long term, is a really tricky tightrope to walk. And I think there's dangers, especially when you look at the uncertainty that we've dealt with over the last 5 years or so, coming out of COVID into the cost of living, rising commodities that you see in the world today. It's challenging. It's really, really hard. And therefore, the danger is actually you can depart from some of these principles. It would be really easy to take a different track. But actually, I think that the harder, the bolder, the braver choice is to stay the course. And that's something that I talk about being a custodian of these brands, and we are custodians and nothing more. We're in these roles to make sure that these brands are in a better place than when we took over from them. And to do that, you've got to be in it for the long game. You've got to be in it in terms of investing into that brand, investing to what it stands for, to what it means to consumers, and to everything around it, whether it's the distinctive assets, the creative, to your organization, to your infrastructure. It's so important to do that, and that's something that we hold very, very disciplined to in the organisation, but it's not without its challenges, and I think it's one of those moments where it'd be naive to think so, because everyone in this room and outside are facing those challenges on a day-to-day, so it's important to stay the course.
Right. So what I'm picking up, I think these are really good points, because there are three big themes emerging from just this. One, and I think it is a conversation that we need to remind ourselves that repetition and consistency aren't quite the same thing, which is a really important strategic point. The other thing that I pick up from what you're saying, Claire, which is really interesting, is that there is a need to be both timeless and timely, to be both current and enduring. And the only way you can do that is if you have something that has the power to prevail, but you can keep energizing it in new ways that are culturally interesting and captivating and all of that. So I get that. And then the third point that I'm picking up from you, Dave, is this idea that once you've hit upon a value, it's not in vain that we say things like value system. That value has to be a system because it weaves through the entire marketing organization and the entire enterprise, you'd argue, through every act, not just through campaigns. So we're talking about values becoming systems. We're talking about repetition and consistency not being quite the same thing, and we're talking about being current and enduring at the same time. So that's all really, really good. Let's move into the next part of the conversation. This is about growth, and we've talked, these to me are really ingredients of determining whether the growth that we're manifesting is in fact robust. What would you say is your biggest growth, most urgent and important growth objective for year 2024?
I think it's, well,
I mean, if you don't want to give out real KPIs.
I think it's, I'm not going to do that because I think like we'll end up boring everyone, to be honest. But I think in terms of we have clear commercial KPIs, clear consumer brand KPIs. For me, in terms of driving growth, the only way to do that in a consistent way is understanding who your consumer is. And I think it was said earlier on in one of the presentations in terms of how you drive value for a consumer. Mm-hmm. And so if you talk about what's the biggest challenge, it's staying relevant, staying current, and understanding that challenge that consumers are going through and how you deliver against that in the best possible way. And it's one of those moments where that is constantly moving as well. So the expectations of consumers changing, and the expectations of brands, whether you're new or you're 200 years old, are constantly changing. And I think that's probably one of the watch-outs for an organisation and a brand like Cadbury that has been around forever and ever, is actually the ability to stay current is something that we've got to make sure that we're constantly focused on. We're constantly, I mean, this is one thing that I have a real passion point for my teams, and I don't think we do it enough actually, is go and speak to consumers, see consumers, understand how they interact with your products, understand how they're using your brands, and only then can you really find a ways to add value into that moment. So I think we could talk about in terms of commodities and what they're going to mean for us as a commercial organisation, of course. But I think the challenge for driving growth is going to come back to the consumer. And if you hold that at the heart of everything you do, then you have a chance of delivering brilliant business outcomes. You know, I'm not surprised you say that. But last week, I read that 8 out of 10 CMOs, I'm not sure whether that's one of the CMO surveys, and globally for the Fortune 500 companies, they said their biggest anxiety for 2024 is that they worry they will not know enough about people they want to market to. And on the other hand, we've never had more resources and more data that's been generated and then been made available. So there's this, it's really quite a conundrum. So I get that. So the biggest growth challenge and driver is to really understand people more intimately and more precisely. And we'll come to the cost of precision in a second, but before we do, what would you say your biggest growth challenge objective is for next year?
I think, of course, awareness, because we have to be realistic that we are still a really young brand, and I think we are quite London-centric, so sometimes you have to pull yourself out of that London bubble and remember that tons of people do not know who Lucky Saint is. I think that idea of adding value, though, is really important to us because one of our big growth focuses is Lucky Saint on draft. And we were chatting before that the idea of innovation doesn't always have to be something brand new, and a beer brand going on draft doesn't sound very innovative, but actually an alcohol-free beer going on draft and doing it really well and having amazing glassware, and we have an amazing quality technician who travels around and makes sure that our beer is pouring correctly, which again doesn't sound very innovative for a beer brand, but actually is for alcohol-free, and that adds a huge amount of value. And we had a lot of kind of consumer calls, and again people kept saying to us the difference it makes when you're not drinking to have a pint, an actual pint, and not have to be the one with a bottle is huge. And it's such an emotional thing of sat in the pub. And I did Dry January, and I'm not just saying that because I work for Lucky Saint, I actually did it, which I was super proud of. But I was in the pub the other day and I had a pint of Lucky Saint, and it does make such a big difference. All my friends had pints, and so did I, and I didn't feel left out. And so that's a really big focus for us, not just because it's a huge opportunity. You know, most places only have one tap available for alc-free, so if you are that beer, it's a big win. But also from a brand perspective and just what that communicates to our consumers about inclusivity and you are welcome here, you're welcome at the pub. And I don't know how many people know, but Lucky Saint bought a pub a year ago. We work above it. So we literally have to go through the pub on your way out, which is a challenge. Sometimes people are always pulling you back in, saying, come on, stay for a pint. But that's really an important part of our brand, and it's huge value add for consumers that they can sit and enjoy a pint with their friends. That's such an emotional thing, especially for Brits, I think. So that's a big growth focus for us.
That's great. You know, Claire, you said something that's, a really good point for us to kind of take on now, the importance of building trust. And that's something that's common that's where advertising and politics do intersect and overlap. Let's just talk about that for a second, because at a conference like this is when we see advertising in its broadest economic context, right? It's a big year for us here. It's a big year for our friends across the pond. We're going to see a lot of activity. But one thing, and building trust is so crucial, but the other two things that we've kind of talked about, we've skirted around, is this thing about getting to very precise, a level of precision with which we can target people and engage with them, and getting there quite quickly, because that's the other thing. So to get precision and speed at scale consistently, that seems to be like the golden formula, if you will. But to what extent do you think the price of precision and speed is paid by creativity? Is that a conversation? Because we know that's another conversation out there. Just how compelling and how creative can you be if all you have to do is get there very, very quickly and very precisely? So, you're there. We're kindred spirits. We're from the same neck of the woods. So how are we thinking about this? Like, what are we telling people? And
I think it's so overwhelmingly attractive, the idea of being able to speak to every single individual very personally, very intimately, at that particular moment when they're thinking or feeling a certain thing. But I'll be totally honest with you, when I see some of the work that is done at scale, whether it's personalization or whatever else, a lot of it can leave me feeling quite cold, because I think when data is involved, sometimes data can make things make sense and create meaning in a logical sense, but it doesn't necessarily make you feel something. And I think, we do a lot of what we call empathy at scale work. And I think, that work is important because you can connect more deeply and more individually. But there is huge risk that comes with it, I think, when it becomes a data machine and we start making ads by putting in numbers and pushing things out, because do you actually really genuinely make people feel? Or does it just become, I'm matching this message with this moment because I think you might be thinking this thing at this particular time? And I think, ultimately, whilst personalization and data is going to be super important for us as an industry and for politics moving forwards, I think we have to also think, going back to that point of that David was making about, the importance of being fabric of the nation, and building those collective moments as well, and building that collective feeling. Cadbury isn't just a chocolate brand for an individual, it is our chocolate brand for the nation, the same way that hopefully Lucky Saint will be our beer as a nation.
Fingers crossed.
If we're alcohol-free. So I think thinking about the collective as well as the individual is really, really important for brands to be truly meaningful and to have impact at scale.
I think to add to that, as a startup, we don't have as much data as some people. And I think it's sometimes if you look just at the data, you're missing the emotional bit there as well. So for us, for example, like the data might say that the first drink of the evening for everybody is Coca-Cola, and we might go, right, let's base our whole ad campaign around
thought it was a vodka martini, but okay.
upselling to a Lucky Saint and put that all over our ads. But that's almost too functional, when actually when we started having calls with consumers rather than just looking at data, people were telling us all the time that the thing they felt about alcohol-free was that it was always a compromise. It was always a zero version of something else. And if you look at loads of alcohol-free ads, it always says no compromise. And that immediately makes you, that whole thing about you say pink elephant, don't think about the pink elephant,
and then you
think
will.
about a pink elephant. So for us, it was about having a brand that felt really proud and unapologetic. And so our ads we haven't gone for the data, we've gone for that little emotional insight that we got from the consumer calls. And I think that can make the big difference, and it can be really tempting to just go with the data because that sounds like the cleverest thing to do. But for us, we didn't really have enough data, so we were sort of forced to go for the emotional insight, and that paid off.
So that's clearly an advantage for you. And I'm curious, David, we were talking about this, that, Cadbury, lots of legacy, history, familiarity, all of that. But you're not devoid from the imperative of, delivering creativity with precision at speed. That's something everyone has to do. What kind of an advantage do you have when you have a lot of legacy that's firmly established, to be able to kind of pivot quickly or to reach niche targets very, very quickly and in interesting ways? Is there an advantage that having that legacy brings you?
Yeah, well, I'd sort of build on Claire's point a little bit first, because I think I see the I don't see it as either or. In terms of creativity and the role that data can play for you. I think it's, if you look at some of the campaigns in particular around our seasonal business, Clare reference around Secret Santa, that emotional connection of sending chocolate secretly to someone you love, but then thinking around then how we can use those relationships that we're building on a one-on-one basis with consumers to go even further than just in terms of the above the line and everything that we see there. So I think that's a real push for all people and all people in our roles, is how do you combine the two? I don't think there's a trade-off there. But coming back to your push in terms of Cadbury, I think like we're in a very fortunate position, right? We're building on a legacy, and I think it genuinely is a legacy, and it's how we talk about the brand as well. We have really strong established memory structures, so much so actually, I think one of the amazing parts of the 200 Years campaign that we've got, and this is where I think we talk about spreading generosity into the world and doing this consistently in the way that we were talking about driving social change. If you look at the activation that we have of bringing back the various designs on our core chocolate bars all the way through the sort of last 100 years in a collectible item. One of the key insights that drove that as an activation was some of the letters that we used to get from care homes that were requesting old packaging from our archives so that they could use it to jog and stimulate memory with people that were struggling in terms of recollecting and with Alzheimer's, with diseases like this. And so when you look at that and you think about the role that your brand can play for people there because of the legacy that's been built over time, that's an incredibly fortunate position to be, and then allows you to drive change from a brand perspective for the good of communities, for the people that buy our chocolate bars, and from a far broader perspective than just selling more chocolate bars.
Is your experience any different when you have, because when I think about Lucky Saint, it hasn't been around for as long. Any advertising investment, you probably have obviously less of a cash flow, but any advertising investment is a significant investment. So does that in some way, does that impact your experience in the same way? Because I think sometimes that when I speak with clients like, who haven't been around for that long, the conversation that comes up is, well, if every investment is such a significant investment, does that mitigate your appetite for risk? And how do you navigate that then? Because growth comes with a cost, with the ability to take risk.
Yeah, so we're really lucky that we have this moment in Dry January where everyone is talking about our category, and not everybody has that. I mean, chocolate maybe has Christmas, but again, there's loads of different people that want to talk at Christmas.
So it's a real aperture.
It's such a moment for us, and we're so lucky to have that. And actually, we've kind of been surprised how few of the big brands take that opportunity, like the Heineken Zeros of the world. So we've really kind of jumped in with both feet during Dry January. And it is a risk because we spend probably half our marketing budget in the first month of the year. So we're all sat there waiting for the results to come in, thinking, please, please let us hit the KPIs, because that will impact the whole rest of the year for us. But we also have to see that as a huge positive. I think also for us, this idea of having an emotional connection. I think working in FMCG, we're so lucky that the products that we market are in people's homes, and that's such a privilege. And I think for us, alcohol is such a kind of emotional product in general, which can be a blessing and a curse. I think now, sat in front of all of you guys with these amazing brands, I can't believe how far we've come. But I remember the first year that we did events, just before COVID hit, we went and did Manchester Craft Beer Festival, and they gave us the stand right at the front. And so there were all these like burly lads turning up, ready to get really drunk, and we greeted them, being like, "Would you like to try some alcohol-free beer?" And it was a nightmare. I mean, people laughed in our face, like people were pointing and laughing. So we've come a long way, and so it can be a disadvantage that people are so offended at the idea of alcohol-free. But actually, we've used that to our advantage because it is so emotional, and we've picked our moment to go big. We've made sure our messaging is kind of bold and brave and confident rather than apologetic, especially with a topic that can be a bit polarizing. You want to be bold. You don't want to kind of be the middle ground. So I think, to answer your question in a very long-winded way, I think strangely, even as a small brand, I think because our ambitions are very similar in the sense we want to be legacy, and we talk about being iconic quite a lot, which sounds odd to sit around talking about being iconic. But we kind of have that same thing of like, we're lucky enough to have that emotional connection with our consumers, and we want to play on it. And we're lucky to be in a category that is a little bit polarizing, so we can, we take risks, but we know we're going to have a big impact when we do, because either you're going to love it or you're going to be really offended, but still you're talking about us.
But there's something very interesting. Sorry, Claire, you're going to say something.
No, I just think that Michael Porter talks about creating shared value, and I think brands and consumers and doing the right thing don't have to be at odds. Capitalism can be a force for good if those things converge and if they are done in the correct way. And if they're thought about, driving growth doesn't have to be bad. It can be really good for the planet, it can be really good for society, and it can be really good for culture. But what it requires is good strategic thinking from the outset, which it sounds like you guys are doing in spades.
Yeah, we've learned today. I mean, I, for one, am a believer in, it's beyond reasonable doubt proven that what's good for society is good for business. And I'm really pleased that we're pushing that discourse over here and proving that in so many ways. But the other thing that I think is worth landing is this idea about knowing when and where to look to kind of create the assets that are going to help you endure. So to be timeless and timely, as we would say, you have a clear aperture in Dry January to get it right at that moment, to actually be able to use that as a foundation to drive growth throughout the year and build a brand. You have moments around generosity that are sprinkled through culture across all consumer passions, that you've then kind of taken them and transformed them into brand properties. So that's something that's very, very striking in the way, those are really clear strategies for this room. We're almost out of time, but I do have one question for everyone over here. This is about advertising and politics, and, we're all keenly involved and informed in both parts of that conversation. It's an open question. Anyone can answer this, start and build. What do you think we as an industry can learn from politics, and vice versa? What do you think the political campaigns can and should learn from the most effective marketing campaigns?
I would say, I think with political parties or brands, people want to align themselves with a brand or a political party that shares their values. And I think if you're really clear about what your values are and you keep them consistent, people respond positively to that. If you flip and flop all the time, people lose trust, and we were talking about trust a lot. So an example for us is that we aren't actually super evangelical about not drinking. We know that 80% of people who drink Lucky Saint are alcohol drinkers, and that's been the same from the very beginning. Whereas if we'd started from a point of kind of being very puritanical about it, and then suddenly went, oh no, actually we do think it's okay to drink, and changed our mind all the time, we would have lost that trust. So I think both ways you can learn from each other, to be consistent, to build trust, but to set your values and stick to them.
Got it.
I'll go very quickly because this is flashing at us.
Like a bomb's about to go off.
I think it's about being distinctive. If I look at whether you love them, loathe them, regardless of your political persuasion, you look at the characters and the main actors in politics at the moment, whether it's Trump, Farage, Boris in the past, it's about being distinctive. And I think resonating with a particular consumer subset underneath that. So I think, again, I'm not holding any political persuasion on this stage at this point in time, but I think if you look at the main actors there, it is about being distinctive and having a very clear tone of voice that people can resonate with. And I think that is something that translates directly from politics to advertising and back again.
I'm going to end by saying make people feel, Because I think with politics, it's very easy to get stuck on the numbers or facts or try and persuade people with facts and policies and things that we're going to do. But ultimately, the best way to make someone persuade something of anything is to make them feel. So emotion would be my thing. And I think in the other direction, I think politics has a brilliant ability to make things very, very personal sometimes. And sometimes I think as an industry, advertising forgets that. So personal and emotional exchange would be mine.
That's a wonderful way to bring this conversation to an end. I have a view on it as well, but we're out of time. But I will say that if there's one quality I think that strikes me about the most successful politicians and the most successful people in our industry, it is the ability to demonstrate and operate from a place of courage at all times, because you just can't do any of this without that, I feel, in the best work. I see courage in spades in your work, some of your thinking. So let's just hope and wish for a year where we see more of that. Thank you all so much for joining me, and thank you all so much for listening. Thank you.